Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Oren. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here this evening. I'm excited to be back. This place looks a little bit familiar to me. It's nice to be here. I will say that this is a talk that I may have presented in 2018, but hopefully I can't actually remember if I did this presentation or not. Hopefully you will not remember, and if you did, there's been some updates. There's some new information as well, and it's always good. One of the wonderful things in Judaism is that Judaism doesn't focus so much on learning, because when you learn something, you then learn for it, and you learn it for the test, and then it goes in one ear and out the other. But when you study something, you come back to it over and over again. So hopefully this is going to be either new or this is going to be something that is a refresher. I want to welcome everybody who is on Zoom here as well. We're so glad that you're here with us as well. So we are excited to be able to explore some of these questions of, has science replaced God? And I'm going to say the answer right up front so you can all leave and go home right now. My answer is no, science has not replaced God. I think that's probably not going to be a surprise. I'm not going to come in as a rabbi and say, yes, science has replaced God. Science has not replaced God in my mind, but it's a much more interesting question as to why. And what we're going to look at over this bit of time, however long will be, probably about an hour or so, of looking at these questions of how and why is this a question, a conversation in our society right now, and how can we think about the relationship between science and religion in a more constructive way rather than a more destructive way. And I want to start with a little bit of my own biography here. So I grew up in suburban New York. I am a massive baseball fan. I'm a huge Yankees fan. It's very hard for me not to be checking my phone right now to see if Aaron Judge is going to end up being the unanimous MVP. We'll find out afterwards here. But I would often go to sleep calculating batting averages. That was one of the reasons I loved baseball. I loved math. I loved science. I did experiments in my kitchen. I don't think I ever blew off an eyebrow, but I would do little experiments at home. And I also was very involved in my Jewish community. When I grew up, my dad, who I actually is watching on Zoom as well, my dad was the president of our synagogue when I was growing up, so I literally learned how to walk in the synagogue. My mom was on the board, so when she was on the board, I would be in the library with my baseball encyclopedia and calculating all my batting averages there. So I grew up loving both science and math on one side and Judaism on the other. And I started college as a math major. I loved math. And about halfway through my sophomore year, for a variety of reasons, I switched from math to religion and Jewish studies, which was the best decision that I ever made. And one of the things was that I learned from my mother as well, this is a line that she uses, is that math would give answers. And what I realized is there are so many questions in this world, and we want to be able to have answers. But rather than having answers, what we need more are responses. My mother used to say, life is not multiple choice, life is an essay question. And so I started to move away from math because it was so clear about what the right answer was. If you work hard enough, you can solve it, and if you add 2 and 2, it is always going to be 4. But with Judaism and with religious traditions, there are a lot of ways to respond to these conversations. And so I went to rabbinical school, and I spent 7 years in the pulpit rabbinate, and realized that I was starting to come back to questions of science. I actually really grew to love cognitive science, which is why I started Sinai and Synapses. The synapses are the parts of your brain that help you learn. And as I was doing all of this work, I was finding that my congregants actually really loved what I was bringing in. But I was also noticing something in the political sphere. And you may have noticed that the political discourse is not good. Maybe a little bit not so. But the political discourse has actually been not good, or toxic, maybe be another word, has been pretty toxic for a while. And it's been going downhill for a long time. Because a lot of the conversation, it used to be, when you used to talk to somebody that you disagreed with, it was often something along the lines of, oh, tell me about where you're coming from. That's an interesting point. Tell me why you think what you're thinking. And then it's become, no, I'm right. And then it became, no, I'm right, you're wrong. And then it became, I'm right, you're stupid. And now it's, I'm right, you're evil. And you can actually look at some of the political data of, if you ask people on both sides of the aisle, Do you think the country is going to collapse in on itself or some sort of thing? Both sides of the aisle are going to say, yes, right? It is the other side that is destroying America. And one of the things that I started to realize is that the conversation about science and religion is part of that discourse. In our public conversation today, there's essentially a perception of two sides. One side is viewed as scientific and educated and liberal, and the other side is viewed as religious and uneducated and conservative. And if you've got to buy one thing in either of those columns, you've got to buy everything in that column, and you get even more points if you demonize the other side. And so that's what we're going to spend actually a lot of our time talking about here this morning, or this evening, because what we're going to explore are 4 different ways that the science and religion conversation happens, and why it's so destructive, and how can we have a better conversation about science and religion. So throughout the talk here, I'm going to be asking questions and responses. Would love to hear people's thoughts in here. Oren, I don't know if you'll be able to, if people on Zoom can sort of virtually raise their hand, and so that Oren, who is Rabbi Oren Steinmetz, who's the rabbi at Kol Ami, is running the tech back here to be able to open up any of the conversations if there are people adding in their ideas as well. But what we're going to look at are 4 different ways in which we can think about and talk about the conversation between science and religion in increasing sophistication, in increasing nuance. We're going to start with what I think is the least nuanced, worst way to think about it, and we're going to ultimately end up with what I think is the best way to be able to look at it. At least that's the way that I take it. I'm going to make an argument on this. They're all going to start with the same 3 letters, with the letters C-O-N. So hopefully it'll be easy to remember. They're all going to start with con. And we're going to go in increasing order of nuance of the ways in which we think about the relationship between science and religion. So the first, and hopefully this will work, is the conflict model. The conflict model here, it did not import the way that I wanted to on my PowerPoint here as well. So hopefully you'll be able to figure out what I'm trying to say. The conflict model is religion is on one side, science is on the other. If you have to accept one, you've got to reject the other. So, the first question that I want to think about here, and I want to phrase this in a particular way, is who buys into this model? When you think of people who buy into this model of science versus religion, who do you think of? And here's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about somebody, but viewing it in a positive light, right? It is very easy to be able to say, it's those idiots who are on the other side. Nobody views themselves as the villain in their own story. Everyone views themselves as the hero of their own story. So when you think about the people who buy into this model of science and religion, science versus religion, and this conflict model, when you think of it, who do you think of, and why do you think they buy into it? What does it do for them? So I'm going to open this up for conversations here. When you think of this model of science versus religion, pick one, the other is stupid or evil. Who do you think of? You can raise your hand or, yeah.
Not stupid, but I was raised in a Southern Baptist environment, and that's very conservative. No great distinction.
So you grew up where you were on the religion side, but against science. Terrific. So we're going to talk about that actually in a minute. So that's where we're going to go. That's the first side that we're going to look at in a second. So let me, if I can ask you, what positive reason did you have for that? Right? You were not trying to do this. You were not trying to be a horrible, evil person being anti-science. I'm assuming there was a good reason within your worldview. So what was that? If you don't mind sharing a little bit.
Well, I loved learning also. I was fascinated by science. I was an elementary school teacher and wanted to share that with the kids. Mm-hmm. So, but I had this religious very conservative upbringing. But long story short, I abandoned that during the Vietnam War era when I was in college. So I had to deal more with the reality of the situation.
So some of that is both the politics and the political element, and also the reality of life. Thank you. Terrific. Thank you. Let's stay on that for one side. When we think of the people people who accept religion and reject science, when we think of that group, who do we think of? other thoughts that people think about here? And if there's anyone on Zoom, they can also. Yep. Oh, if you don't wait for the mic, if you just wait for the mic here for the people on Zoom to be able to hear. Well, not on Zoom. That's.
Sorry, Zoomies. I think that, I agree with Gary that it tends to be on the more conservative end of things, but I also think it's fear-based.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when you're raised from a young age with a certain set of beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
It's to step outside of that.
Mm-hmm.
It causes a lot of anxiety. And so I tend to think of it as being people who have high anxiety or fear.
And so I think that is a big part of that. Thank you very much.
And I was going to speak from the science, from the other side. I think scientists. No, I want to change that. I think people see scientists as being the ones, that if you're a scientist, you're anti-religion.
Yeah.
And I do not believe that's true, but I think people see it that way.
We're going to get to the science side in a second. You bring up an important point, which is the level of fear and anxiety. Fear and anxiety is actually a very valuable thing to be able to feel. There is a reason that evolution instilled in us a fear response. Right? It is good if you say, I'm not afraid of that, you're going to die. We're trying to teach our kids of what's appropriate fear and what's inappropriate fear. So that's part of the challenge. But there's also value in being, and I'm going to say a small c, conservative. There is value in conserving what tradition has to say. There is wisdom that has come down from thousands of years, whether that's religious tradition, whether that's political tradition. There is value in knowing that what has worked for thousands of years, at least there is something to be, it is worth to at least engage in those questions and conversations. So we are always torn between being able to have a conservative bent and a liberal bent. We are never fully one or the other, and different people are going to strike the balance in different kinds of ways. But I think you're right that it tends to be people who are a little bit more conservative. New ideas can potentially be threatening because it upsets the apple cart. Right? We've seen this in all sorts of different ways with the Vietnam War, with civil rights. Right? That it tends to upset the apple cart a little bit, and so that there's a pushback that happens naturally. So that's 100% there. Thank you. Maybe one or two other thoughts here. Yeah.
It seems to me that from an early age, it's easy to accept that, that religion is what it is, and that is all right.
Mm-hmm.
But also from an early age, it's easy to be confused by science.
Mm-hmm.
When you're telling a child they have to wash their hands before eating or after going to the bathroom.
Yep.
This is something that you cannot explain, the whole concept of bacteria and viruses and all this other stuff and how it makes us ill. It is, and it's way beyond what a young child can understand. So that science starts out as being something that's difficult and hard to understand long before you get to physics and all that, and chemistry and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's a great point. And I thought actually where I thought you were going to go, and again, I talk a lot about my kids because I've got a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, but you think about, my kids have asked, like, where did the universe come from, right? And it's a lot easier to be able to say, God did it, than to try to understand Big Bang cosmology and Darwinian evolution. It is hard for adults to understand Darwinian evolution. It is hard for adults to understand Big Bang cosmology. But being able to say, God created it, that is a clear, coherent story, right? And it feels good. And so it's something that we often teach to kids, understandably, because kids understand stories much better than complex mathematical equations. So there's both the how do we impart values to our kids, and that's links to your piece about conservatism, right? We try to be able to teach our kids to follow the rules and and listen to their teachers and listen to their parents, right? Because sometimes they need to be taught to be able to do that, because their natural inclination may be to rebel. And so how do we let them both be who they are in the fullness of who they are, and how do they function in a society right now, right? You need to be able to, rules and religion can be very helpful there. And so, again, that's why there's a big debate of how many rules do we need? Who should be enforcing those rules? That's where a lot of the complicated questions come in. So thank you. So I want to share a little bit of ideas of who buys into this model, and particularly why I think a lot of people do. So who buys into this model? One side again, it comes to this idea of that it's easier to be able to understand something. This is a slogan that you may sometimes see a lot, I would say, in the Midwest, in the South, not so much in suburban New York. I'm not sure in central New York, but this idea of God settles it, I believe it. If God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Right? And it becomes a lot easier to be able to say, this is what I'm going to do. One of the hard things, and we can think about this with COVID, and COVID is a phenomenal example with this. COVID, of trying to be able to make decisions, if you can remember about 2 years ago, even into last year, of trying to be able to follow, I don't like the phrase, but I'll say follow the science, right? Of do you mask, do you not mask, how many people do you need to be? I don't know about you, I wanted to say, somebody tell me what to do. Don't make me have to make every single decision to be able to look at all the epidemiology. Just somebody tell me what to do, please. Right? Trying to be able to look at understanding all the nuances of the science or all the nuances of what our decisions are, it's really hard. It takes a big cognitive load. Being able to say, I don't have to think so much about this. Sometimes we look down on that, but there is value in being able to say, I can trust someone. Again, whether we think this is an accurate statement or not is a different discussion, but if you are part of a community that says, I will trust what my pastor, what my rabbi, what my political leader has to say, if I am going to trust what they are going to say, then I can then go on with my life in other different ways. I don't have to think about that particular idea so much. So there is value in being able to say, if God said it, I believe it, that settles it. There's another reason why I think this is the idea, at least the perception of religion versus science. So if we think about the arguments of religious people pushing against science, they're not really pushing against science specifically. For a while, when I used to do this pre-COVID, there was predominantly two ideas. Now it's maybe, we might even say three. One is evolution. The other is climate change, and maybe you can do some conversations about vaccines and COVID-related stuff. But nobody is signing petitions saying, we cannot teach Newton's laws of motion. Newton's laws of motion are going to corrupt our children. Nobody is picketing saying that. It's not science, it's particular kinds of science where there's political valences, where there's community elements of this. And I want to think about, for example, evolution. Why is there a perception that there is a rejection of evolution in religious communities? If you think about this, it actually kind of makes sense, because I'll ask you, on a day-to-day basis, how much do you think about Darwinian evolution? Right, yeah, right. Not much, right? It is not a live issue for you all that much. What are the live issues for you all, right? This is, am I going to be able to pay my mortgage, or am I going to pay my rent? What's the cost of groceries right now? Am I going to be able to see my kids or my grandkids? These are these issues of is my friend in the hospital? Does somebody need something right now? Those are the live issues, not so much of the Darwinian evolution. So what ends up happening, though, Darwinian evolution can be a little bit of a scary idea when it comes to religion, because Darwinian evolution, at least as it's presented, it actually has an idea that evolution is purposeless, that there's no grand plan. Religion, almost by definition, says there is a plan for us. God has a plan for us. And so evolution and religion can be on a ground level, can be very threatening, because what will happen is evolution ends up becoming what they call naturalism, of like this, there's only one thing that is nature here, which can lead to atheism, which can lead to nihilism. You can get off that train at a few different places, but it is a train where the tracks are linked. It's hard to get off that track as well. Does that make sense to everybody? So if you are somebody who is part of a conservative community, a Christian community, and if you were to say, I think that our Darwinian evolution is the right way to understand it, what's the upside? Very, very, very little, right? There's very, very little to be able to say. What are the downsides, though, if you're a member of a conservative religious community who raises your hand and says, yes, I think Darwinian evolution is accurate? What's the downside? Ostracism, right? What happens? Like, why would you be ostracized? You're threatening? You're not one of the sheep? Well, like I said, I don't want to. Right, or yeah, right. There's a wolf. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? There's your support system, particularly in conservative Christian communities, even more so than liberal religious communities. Conservative Christian communities, that is their support system. That's where people get their food. That's where people go to the hospital. That's ideally what the liberal religious community should be doing as well. But conservative Christian communities and conservative communities as well tend to be very tight knit. And if you rock the boat, there's a lot that you're going to lose. There's almost no upside and a huge, tremendous downside. And so when we think about it, if we're people who tend to be, why do these people not accept science? Why don't we at least get into the mindset and to be able to say, without demonizing the other side, this is something that I actually learned from a NASA astrophysicist named Dr. Jennifer Wiseman, who grew up in the Ozarks as an evangelical Christian. And she was the one who really taught me about this, that this is really what the risks can be. So this is this idea of who buys into the idea on the religion side. But now let's think about the people who buy into this idea of science on the side of religion. When you think of the people who say, I am going to accept science and reject religion, who do you think of? What kind of people come up? Yeah.
Well, first of all, atheists. I administer a political message board where most of the participants are militant atheists. And the reaction to everything in the political sphere is immediately to denounce religion.
Right.
And I think they know that I'm a professional religious worker and they don't mind hurting my feelings.
So you talk about, I really want to draw a couple distinctions of, you said atheists. Not all atheists are anti-religious. Right? Atheism and science do tend to go together. There could be a lot of philosophical and sociological reasons. Interestingly, actually, professors in the humanities tend to be even more atheistic than scientists, which is a whole other conversation to be able to have. But there's a difference, I would say, between an atheist and what we might call an anti-theist. An atheist is someone who doesn't believe there's a God. An anti-theist is someone who doesn't want there to be a God. And so when you talk about militant atheists, right? They say, I don't want to have any part of religion. Why? Why do you think they buy into that particular model there?
Well, first of all, religion, if it's successful, is a challenge to their beliefs and it interferes with their lives.
Mm-hmm. So some of that is they'll conflate the idea of religion and what we might say white Protestant Christian nationalism, right? Which is a very narrow definition of religion. But that's often what they're rejected. That's what they're pushing against.
Yeah. When I said that I think they know that I'm a professional religious worker, I think they would say that what I teach isn't religion.
Right. And I've had there are a lot of people where I've had a lot of conversations with atheists, and I present what I think religion is, and they said, "Boy, if religion was what you were saying, I wouldn't be an atheist." It's because so some of that is this. Of a rejection of hegemony that happens, and that I think there are people who are pushing against that, even within the Christian community, also against hegemony there. But sometimes it ends up being a very, very narrow definition of what religion is. So it's a false perception of what religion is. It's a false perception of what Christianity as a whole is as well. So thank you.
It's comparing the worst in religion with the best in atheism, basically.
Yeah, right. It's comparing. It's not comparing apples to apples. It's what people would call a straw man. They want to find the absolute worst in both sides. Which, by the way, some religious people find the worst in science and be able to punch down as well. So that's another part of that for sure. Any other thoughts as to why people buy into this accepting science and rejecting religion? Sorry, accepting science and rejecting religion.
My sense is, and I know this isn't true either, that science is, you don't have to have faith in science.
Mm-hmm.
Science is more tangible.
Yes.
And religion, by its very nature, is based on faith, not proof. I mean, to some extent, you can prove scientific theories, and that's how science works. You know, it proves to a certain point, and then it tries to go beyond that. And you know, I think about during COVID and all the scientific stuff that was coming out, and like science is constantly changing. They learn something new. It goes a little bit further, and people would point and say, "Well, see, science doesn't work." And so, but I think from a science standpoint against religion, that there's a certain amount of provability to an extent.
Yeah, although I'm actually going to make a slightly subtle change on that in a couple minutes. So you're right that religion almost by definition is something that we take on faith. Faith, and in Hebrew, of the word of faith and trust there. And science says there's a line that says, "In God we trust; all others must show data." Right? That there's an idea that science, you don't take anything on faith. You've got to be able to show your work there. So that's which by the way, in the political sphere, that's ideally the way that we should be making decisions, is using, at least in my mind, a combination of both data and values here. So yeah.
Speak while the microphone's right here.
Yeah.
One of the conversations that I've had with conservative Christians who are interested in a conversation, when they know that I am a scientifically based person, but also a person of faith, they say to me, "Gary, if you don't believe in the literal explanation of the creation of the world in Genesis, you don't believe, Joshua and the trumpets and parting the Red Sea, and if you don't believe in the virgin birth, Gary, what kind of faith do you really have?" Mm-hmm. And I think what people are really afraid of is that if you keep chipping away at what many conservatives believe is the literal interpretation of the Bible, what do you have when it's left? You naturally come to that train up there.
Yep.
Atheism and whatever.
Yep, and that's exactly where we're going to go, and with the next model up. That's exactly right. So
we have someone on Zoom. We have Ashley here.
Okay.
Yeah, I know from some conversations with people. I think, I don't want to call it bitterness, but almost there's I can't think of another word, but I think sometimes with people, scientists, doctors, things like that, there's almost a something like when people say, "Oh, thank God for healing me. He got me through this," and then they say, "Oh, well, it was also medicine, or it was also my work. It was also all this science that got me through this," and then so then they become a little. I can't think of I think it's bitter toward the religious aspect that people are praising about it. Saying, "Well, what about my hard work? What about all this that this team of doctors, this team of scientists that came up with the vaccines, the COVID, that healed all these people." So I think that pushes them farther away from the religious side to say, it wasn't God that healed you, it wasn't God that saved you, it was this team of this group of people. They kind of then become disillusioned even more than they were.
Yeah, I think thank you. I think that's a great point, and there is a level of bitterness. And what I also thought you were going to go, and so I want to link what you're saying to other ideas, which is that I think another reason that a lot of people reject religion is that there's been, I think no one could could deny this. There's been a lot of evil that's been done in the name of religion, right? There's been a lot of evil that's been done to individuals. There's been a lot of evil that's been done to groups in the name of God, in the name of religion. We can't just say, well, that was bad religion. No, that was part of what religion was. And so that's more subtle now with COVID. But that's, I think, part of the piece of this of how badly religion has presented itself and all the evil that has been done in its name.
Equally, evil has been done in the name of science. You have CIA experiments where in foreign countries where they introduce prostitutes into prisons and to see whether or not the drugs that they were going to use for syphilis and various STDs would work. The ones down with the black syphilis, CD. So there's evil on both sides.
Yes.
And I think the Nazi Holocaust showed the evil that a doctor can do. I won't even mention his name because to me it should never be spoken again. But he committed some phenomenal scientific work that as a doctor, I think some of his work was brilliant. But the suffering and the lack of care with which he did it set that area of medicine back years, because no one, sometimes to be effective, you have to reproduce something again. Who could ever reproduce his work? Who would ever want to?
You bring up an important point, which is the question of whether you talk about science versus scientism. And it's a classic quote from, I am shocked, is now 30 years old, from Jurassic Park, which I think probably everyone has seen, but it's a line that's used all the time where Jeff Goldblum, as the scientist, is talking, as they're recreating the dinosaurs, and he said, your scientists were so concerned with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think about whether or not they should. And religion is where that conversation can come in, because religion is a whole bunch of shoulds. Here's what you should do to at least be in conversation. So there is, and again, I don't know, in the same way I don't think it's valuable to necessarily argue which side has done more evil has been done, but there definitely has been evil done in the name of science and with the tools of science. And I think that's again where part of the conversation is so toxic right now, is because each side is saying, you're the evil one, why don't you realize all the evil that you are doing, without actually doing, the Hebrew word is the cheshbon hanefesh, of the soul searching within ourselves. So there's still a whole bunch of that I want to be able to get through here, so I'm going to just pause for a minute and thank you for all these great questions and comments. I want to continue with what we were talking about of why people buy into this model of on the science side. Linking to a lot of what we said, one is that there are a lot of people who say, this idea of science, it's like magic but real. Right? There's a perception that religion is a bunch of fairy tales. Science, though, that's real. Or science communicators of Neil deGrasse Tyson, and again, this is, I should make sure that he actually said this. It is one of those things that it's so good that it could be attributed to a variety of different pieces, but what's often said is that the good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. Right, so this question of belief that's where this idea of science can ground it. And there is value in this kind of way. But there's a lot of problems. We talked already about what some of the problems are on the people who accept religion and reject science. We can easily think of the problems there from trying to battle climate change to vaccine. We can understand how sometimes the push against science can be really problematic. But I want to share a short little clip of a video of somebody who is anti-religious. Somebody that you may have heard of. His name is Richard Dawkins, who presents himself as one of the great science communicators. And you know what? He is actually a very good science communicator. He is a brilliant biologist. He is also an atrocious theologian. He has written a book called The God Delusion. It was part of a whole bunch of what's called the New Atheists. And about 10 years ago, he wanted to start something called the Reason Rally. And just by show of hands, if you heard there was something called the Reason Rally, and it was going to be in September of I think it was in September of 2012, I believe, right before the political election, the presidential election, raise your hand if you think that reason would be a good thing before a major presidential election. I think most people would say, oh, you don't, yeah, if all you knew was that, right, most people would say, of course I want more reason. So this is Dawkins talking about Catholicism. Yes, from the Reason Rally. And I want you to present yourself, put yourself, whether you may be Catholic here, if you are, fantastic. If you're not, I want you to envision yourself as somebody who is Catholic or somebody who is mildly religious, who has, let's say, medium feelings about science. You're not anti-science, you're not hugely pro-science, but you hear this person as the great communicator about science talking about your faith and your tradition.
Relatives and friends. So when I meet somebody who claims to be religious, my first impulse is don't believe you. I don't believe you until you tell me, do you really believe, for example, if they say they're Catholic, do you really believe that when a priest blesses a wafer, it turns into the body of Christ? Are you seriously telling me you believe that? Are you seriously saying that wine turns into blood? Mock them, ridicule them. In public. Don't fall for the convention that we're all too polite to talk about religion. Religion is not off the table. Religion is not off limits. Religion makes specific claims about the universe which need to be substantiated and need to be challenged and, if necessary, need to be ridiculed with contempt.
So if you are a religious person who is being told that you should be mocked and ridiculed in public with contempt, what is going to be your view on science? It's not, you don't have to be a rocket surgeon to be able to know that this is not a good way to be able to talk about science. And I know it's rocket science and neurosurgery, but so we think of this as the public conversation. So we're going to move to the next three models. I spend a lot of time on this because this is where a lot of people spend their time. If you were to think about this perception of religion and science, and that it's on science and religion, if you were to watch the news, check social media, watch cable news, talk with your friends, about what percentage of the American population do you think would buy into this model? If you were to watch the media right now, what percentage? Yeah, 95, yeah, usually whenever there are people like 90, right, somewhere gets like 75 to 90%, right, that's what people would say. So there's a professor at Rice University named Elaine Howard Eklund who has done some research called the Perceptions Project about how do people view. The number of people who view this model as being in conflict, 25%. 25%. The reason that we think there's so much of this conflict is because conflict sells. Nobody is going to see the 30-second soundbite with incredible nuance than why the other side actually might have a point. That's not going to go viral, right? It's people demolishing each other's side. So only 25% of Americans buy into this model. Here's my next question for you. What percentage of evangelicals do you think buy into this model? Evangelical Christians. You would say more, right?
I'd say 80.
Right. Well, that's the self-identified evangelical. The number there, 25%. It was in a survey. It's in a survey. So.
I would believe the 25 if it was done.
So there's also something that I did not fully understand somebody as a liberal Northeastern Jew, of the difference between evangelical and fundamentalist, which I used to collapse those two. There is a difference between evangelical Christianity and fundamentalist Christianity. Fundamentalist Christianity is it's all literally true and you don't argue against it. Evangelical Christianity, there are actually a large number of liberal evangelicals as well. But part of this is because almost every evangelical Christian deals with science in some way. Most evangelicals have one of these. Most evangelicals, actually more so than a lot of synagogues, are using technology, right? For them, it is a live. Most evangelicals, when they are sick, they will go to their doctor. Right? They need to think about these kinds of questions. They are live issues for the evangelical Christian community. By the way, the percentage of Jews who buy into this model, ready for this number? What I think is particularly fascinating, though, is that if you ask conflicted evangelicals, which side are they going to go on? If they view it as science versus religion, evangelical Christians are going to choose religion. The number there is about 3 out of 4. Conflicted Jews, which do you think they're going to choose? Science. The number there is about 15 out of 16, about 85%, I think maybe even more. So one line we often say through Sinai and Synapses is that the challenge in the Jewish community is not getting Jews excited about science, it's about getting Jews excited about Judaism. And so that's why we do a lot of these presentations here. So I spent a lot of time talking about the conflict model because that's the one that everyone thinks about. This is, when science replaced God because we think about the conflict. We're not going to spend anywhere near the amount of time with the next 3 slides as we did with the first three sessions. But this idea that the conflict model that's the natural model, it's not. It's not. It creates straw man arguments. It's a much smaller population of the American society today. And it creates more demonization, right? Of I'm right, you're evil. We got to move beyond that. So luckily there are slightly more sophisticated ways. This one is going to be a little bit more sophisticated, still a little bit problematic, but works a little bit better, and that's what we would call, went the wrong way, the concert model. The concert model is that science and religion go together. If you understand Genesis in the right way, it will match with Big Bang cosmology. It's sometimes the people who will be able to understand a little bit of, well, here's how the parting of the Red Sea happened here. So when you think of this model, anyone come to mind for this idea? And this may be you. If this is, by the way, if this is you, I end up, as I sometimes joke, if I destroy your faith here, hopefully it'll be rebuilt a little bit more sophisticated. So when you think of this model, who comes to mind? Or what kinds of people come to mind? Some liberal Christians, yeah. And one that often comes up is what we call creationists, or people who are what's called intelligent design, which is not scientific, but it's a religious perspective that is couched in scientific language. The idea is that again that you're able to hold both of these at the same time. But the reason that people the people buy into this model is that it allows them to hold both their science and their religion. It can be very comforting to be able to say, I understand how Noah's Ark happened. I understand how the rains came. But it then becomes a question of, well, how were they able to fit the lions and the giraffes and the zebras and the fleas and it ends up becoming and this is why it actually is a little bit of a problematic model, because we end up getting things like this. Right? We see, right? This is right. We end up trying to be able to say, wait a second. This is we're trying to find putting a square peg into a round hole. Right? If I don't go to these aren't so much in the supermarkets anymore, but it felt like every other week there was the Garden of Eden found, Noah's Ark found. It's like every week it's found here, and so when you were saying earlier that science proves. The problem is that science actually never proves anything. Science disproves. Science tells us what was wrong. I remember talking with a professor of evolutionary anthropology a couple months ago, and he was asked, what percentage of what are you teaching right now, what percentage of that is going to be wrong in 50 years? And he said, 100%. Right? And it's not because they were making it up as they were going along, but because there's new ideas and new questions here. What ends up happening when we hold on to this concert model, it can feel, it's like, it tastes a little bit like candy. It tastes good and it's filling, but it doesn't actually give you the nutrients that you need. And when you discover that something's wrong or problematic, it can actually create an even bigger problem. This is my favorite example to be able to give. So let's say, for example, if you were to be able to say that the patriarchal narratives are literally true. The patriarchal narrative is the story of Abraham and Isaac and Sarah, and the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel and Leah. Let's say they actually literally happened as written down. If that was the case, approximately when would they have lived? Anyone know roughly? Anyone want to take a stab of approximately when? About 3,000 years ago, give or take, right? Maybe 1800 BCE. Let's say 2000 BCE. Let's just say 3,000 years ago. Right? Nice big round number. There is an animal that's actually very important in a story that, believe it or not, is in this week's Torah portion. Anyone want to take a stab at what animal comes up that is, what was it? The camel, yes. The camel that is here. So the camel, if we know the story, it's Abraham's servant. Eliezer brings himself to the well, and Rebekah says, I'll bring water for you and for your camels. So if this is actually true and literally the case, it would have all happened about the year, let's say, 2000 BCE. About 10 to 12 years ago, there was a study that was done in archaeology that they discovered that they said the introduction of domestic camels in the southern Levant, which is where that is, and the camels came into the Middle East, in that part of the world, approximately 900 BCE. About 1,000 years too late.
People who were at this lecture 4 years ago may remember Professor Richard Freund's proclamation that donkeys are good, camels are bad.
Because of this?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. That's so now, and I've seen this in my own life, and you may have experienced this too, right? So you said, I was told that the Bible is literally true. The science is saying the camels aren't there. I've been lied to my whole life. The camels destroyed my faith. What happened here? Everything I taught when my life was a lie. What do I do now? What ends up happening? It ends up collapsing into the conflict model. Right? If you were to show me somebody who's been lied to their whole life, it's really going to depend on where are they going to be in their community. If they are on a more conservative area and tend to be a more pro-religionistic side, or on the side of religion against science, they're going to be very insular and protect themselves. If they're going to be more on the side of science and reject religion, they're going to become atheists or even anti-theists. Right? Because they're going to, and by the way, this is what happens with 6th, 7th, 8th graders who are becoming bar and bat mitzvah in Judaism, because they're learning biology. They're also really starting to push back a lot. And they're studying the Torah more deeply for the first time, and that's where a lot of the existential crises happen for 12, 13, 14-year-olds. So we need to be able to have a better conversation than either it's simply a story. We need something better than, oh, it's literally true. We need something where we can actually talk about these kinds of questions as well. So we ready to go to the next model as well? And I'm going to pause here if there are questions before I go to the next model. I don't know if I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to pause if there are questions for people in person or on Zoom at all.
I just want to say that kind of crisis isn't limited to the ages of 12 and 13. I saw it happen once in a graduate course at Hebrew College.
Yeah, there are people actually. There are stories about the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York where the professor, who's a professor of Bible, starts to explain why the Torah is not literally true. And rabbinical students in their first year, they will either leave the class or they drop out or they have a huge existential crisis of faith because that's what they've been taught their whole life. And it's hard to be able to find the more nuanced way. Yes? Oh, do you have a question? Okay, let me bring the mic over, yeah.
I'm an engineer who, in college, considered becoming a rabbi. So I've got
Simpatico here.
I've got some history there. I remember thinking back in elementary school that they had, whoever they are, had to tell the story in a way that people could understand it. And the older I got, the more sophisticated my thought process was to write the Bible in a way that makes any kind of, quote, scientific sense. It would have to fill this room 1,000 times. And nobody could read it, nobody would read it, nobody would care. So I guess from the very beginning, I treated the Torah as a way to understand what happened without caring so much about the details. We know Adam and Eve couldn't possibly have spoken Hebrew back then. So, I mean, and from there on, it gets worse all the time. But worse is it worse or better, depending on how you talk about it. So that I consider the Torah to be a way to understand the world's evolution and our religious evolution. And like every story, it has to cut corners and so on. So I've never been troubled by the fact that some things don't really make sense, because there has to be a way to get the story across that anybody could ever understand.
Yep.
And I love the discussion about it a lot. I love it intellectually, and it's fascinating, but it doesn't trouble me at all, because I believe in God, but I believe in science equally. And I don't find that to be at all confusing.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's a line that we sometimes say, which is, I say about Genesis, but you can say about the whole Torah. Genesis is not a science textbook. It's not, right? And for some people, it's like, oh, yeah, right? They never thought of it like that before.
Yeah, Geoff, I've said that any number of times to 6th and 7th graders. But in another city, I employed a physicist to teach Parashat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, to 7th grade classes. And she said that the science in the Torah is actually rather good science if you remember the limits of what could be observed at the time.
Yep, right. It was an attempt to be able to understand the world. And by the way, it is not supposed to be necessarily clear, right? If you study Leviticus or Numbers, right, and that's why some of it is the conversations that we talk about. If you study the Torah portion each week, I always wonder. I mean, I know why, but I always wonder. The first few stories from Bereshit and Noach, the first 2 Torah portions, that should be spread out to like 5 weeks, and we can kind of spur through Numbers and Leviticus pretty quickly. But you study what the text is there. In the same way, and it's not a perfect analogy, but in the same way, if you're doing a scientific experiment, you can't fudge the data. The data is the data. You then have to interpret the data, and you've got to say, what are the questions that I'm asking? And you have an argument about what does that data mean, but you can't necessarily move away from what the data says. The data is whatever the data is. It doesn't necessarily, but again, the data is not always clear. In the same way, the Torah is not always clear. And the way that some people make arguments, and some people say, I make this way or that way, and in the same way, by the way, political arguments are not clear. The political argument, and I think it is very problematic to be able to say, I know the right way, and you are doing it, I am doing it right, and you are doing it wrong. Politics is designed to be helping to understand a little bit of how do we make the world slightly better in our corner of the world. And so that's also right. How do we argue? Are we going to follow this policy or that policy? It's again, because these are not religious questions and they're not scientific questions. They're human questions. Who am I? How do I act in this world? So thank you for that. I want to move to the next model up here, which is what we would call the contrast model. So that the worst is the conflict model. That's just useless. It's a pile of rubbish. It's kind of fun to talk about because that's what our society says the concert model works nicely until it starts to, there's a little bit of a shake and you make your foundation and it becomes an earthquake and it collapses in. The contrast model works a little bit better, and it looks like, again, that the circles didn't work the way I wanted to on the export here, so I apologize. Contrast model is religion deals with one side, science deals with the other. They live in their happy spheres. This is the idea of a person that you may have heard of, Stephen Jay Gould, of an idea called non-overlapping magisteria. You may have heard it as religion deals with why and science deals with how. That's another framing here. Just out of curiosity, how many people think that that's the model that they find is most valuable? That they're able to sort of separate this out in this kind of way? A few people, yeah. Most people, actually, that tends to be the one that most Jews tend to buy into. Why does it work for you? What does it do for you to be able to have? If I can ask, it's...
As a doctor, I believe in the science that I know and is known now. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't answer, I think the answer is faith comes into it. If I treat 3 people and they could be twins with exactly the same medication, why does one person get well and live a long, healthy life, and why does the other person die? I believe in the miracle of a birth. Mm-hmm. Because, yes, it's a sperm and an egg, but that sperm and that egg got together and it grew and it lived. Mm-hmm. That's a miracle to me. Mm-hmm. So, and I can't have one without the other. Right. I don't want to have, oh, it's a baby, it's born, let me snip the cord and, hand them off and vaccinate them. I want to rejoice in the miracle that another life, another potential has come into this world.
I love that you use the word, the miracle of birth, and that's the word miracle is such a great word, because when we talk about miracle, religiously we think of miracles. We think of the splitting of the Red Sea, or if you're Christian, the resurrection, right? Those are things that they once, ever, totally superseded all other natural elements. When we think of a miracle, that is a miracle. Birth happens literally thousands of times a day. And yet we talk about it as a birth. We talk about it as a miracle. And some of that is how do we define miracle as a way to orient ourselves. So thank you. And I think for a lot of people, they buy into this model of science and religion separated out because they're able to have their 2 separate worlds. Right? They could be a doctor 6 days a week and come to services on Shabbat, or live their lives on 6 days a week and go to church on Sunday morning. Right? They're able to have their separate worlds. And for most people, by the way, the science and religion discussion, in the same way we were talking about earlier, is probably not so much of a live issue for you all. It is for me. This is my day-to-day work. This is my full-time job. It is very live for me. But for most people, the science and religion discussion is not a day-to-day existential issue. It is, however, part of a larger public conversation, a larger cultural conversation that happens. Because the idea of science and religion having this separate world, having this line on there, it's not so accurate. It's much more that there's sort of a blur that happens as well. Because what's happened over history, if we were to ask you, if I were to say to you, for example, we're into a time machine, and I were to go to the year 1000 CE, and if I were to say, what is the center of the universe, what would your answer be? The Earth. And how do you know that? Because you see it, right? You see it. Or maybe your religious leader talked about it as well, right? There's a little... Then what happened in the 14, 15, 1600s? Telescopes, Copernicus, Galileo created a big religious crisis. Science created a big existential religious crisis. By the way, one of the reasons that the Protestant Reformation happened was because of the technology of the printing press, right? So science and religion, there's a lot that happens there where they influence each other. And so what happened was that all these questions of what is truth, That was religious truth. Science actually bled into that. Religion stopped being about truth with a capital T, and so religion said, no, we're going to be the ones who are going to talk about truth. That's what the scientific revolution started to do. That's what Darwin did with Darwinian evolution and evolution by natural selection. So in sort of the 1900s, science kind of claimed the mantle, at least within liberal religion. Religion stopped being truth with a capital T, and it started being about ethics. I was raised this way. You may have been also. Tell me if this is something that being religious is about being a good person, right? Taught that. All right, now here's my question for you. Do you know religious people who are not ethical people?
One or two.
Do you know ethical people who are not religious? Yeah, QED, right? You do not need to be religious to be ethical. So this has become this big question that's come out of what does religion do in our society right now? It is no longer an element of truth with a capital T. It's no longer necessarily the source of ethics. In my mind, a lot of what religion has done is actually a search for meaning and community. That's something that we actually discovered a lot through COVID, of how much we actually need other people here. And this leads to what I think is the most sophisticated way to think about these conversations about science and religion, which is what we would call the contact model. Contact model is the idea that, as I said a couple minutes ago, the biggest questions that we face in this world are not religious and they're not scientific, they're human. Because how does science progress? How does science progress? Right, scientists, right? Scientists are human. And you ask them, why are you studying what you're studying? And some of them might say, oh my God, I'm done with my PhD, I want to get out of here right now. They may say that. Or you ask them, what got you excited about science in the first place? And they may say something along the lines of, I got to help people. I got to help people heal. I got to see a vision into the universe here. I got to understand, people talk about actually, there's a whole discussion of awe and majesty, right? So it's easy to be able to talk about finding awe and majesty. You ask a scientist, when do you find awe and majesty? There was a whole study done, and there are a bunch of scientists who said that they felt, when they felt awe and majesty was when they were in the lab, and they were literally the only person in the world who knew what they knew. They had just done an experiment, they hadn't yet shared the data, but they figured it out, and they were the only person. They hadn't even told their lab partner yet. And they felt this incredible amount of awe in here. Right? Scientists feel a level of awe. Religion is, and by the way, I'd say religion, not faith, but religion is a human expression of awe and wonder and majesty and community. And by the way, human experience informs science. Human experience informs religion. Both religion and science have changed. A wonderful example of this, of thinking about, for example, the way we think about everything from female clergy to LGBTQ communities, right? Those were things in which human experience changed religion. They said, wait a second, this is what religion is, but we have a better understanding of what it means to be human, so we are going to change religion here. It goes both ways. Religion changes humans, humans change religion. Science is informed by human experience, and human experience, understandably, helps us advance science. And science and religion can actually be in conversation with each other because we're exploring the same kinds of issues. My favorite example of this is from a friend of mine, a guy named Professor Dave DeSteno, who has a phenomenal podcast called How God Works. He's a professor of psychology. He does not necessarily know how God works. I will tell you right now. He does not know how God works. But he is a professor of psychology, and what he describes, he says, is that in a lot of ways, religion is debugged technology, debugged human technology of how to flourish and thrive. And some of the work that Dave has done has been about compassion. And we think about what could be more religious than compassion. Judaism talks about al shlosha devarim, al haTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. The world stands on three things: on Torah, on prayer, and on acts of loving kindness. Christianity, right? Jesus is compassion incarnate. Right? What could be more compassionate? What could be more religious than compassion? Well, we can also figure out what engenders compassion in other people. What prevents people from being compassionate towards others? And what Professor DeSteno has been able to figure out is that actually the way that you engender compassion in others is you find points of similarity. If you find people who are similar, you're going to be more compassionate toward them. If you find differences, you're going to find more ways in which you're going to be less compassionate. So if one person is a Democrat and the other is a Republican, and that's how they present themselves, it's going to lower the compassion level. But if you were to say, I'm from New York, you're from New York, I like going to the Rye Bar and Grill, you like going to the Rye Bar and Grill, right? I like the Yankees, you like the Yankees, we can talk about that. Or if I'm a Yankees fan and you're a Mets fan, we both like baseball, right? You can find ways to be able to actually, for lack of a better word, hack the similarities. Find the points of similarity. What they've also discovered, and you can look at all of his studies about how do you actually measure compassion, but one of the things that they've actually looked at is they created situations where people were connected with totally invented communities. So what they did, they always do this in psychology, there was a ruse. They brought people in, they said, I want you to be able to measure how long a line is. And they said, okay, here's how long the line was. And some people thought the line was this long, and the line itself was this long, and they thought it was this long, and so they were underestimators. And there were some people that they found out, they said they were this long, and it was actually that long, and they were overestimators. They, right, totally made up, right? Of some people were measuring a line, some people were told they were overestimators, some were told they were underestimators. They then created a situation where someone had to be compassionate to another person, and they found that overestimators, when they realized that they were fellow overestimators, they were more compassionate to each other. And when they were fellow underestimators, they were more compassionate to each other. There is zero religious tradition of an underestimator or an overestimator. There's nobody who says, for 300 years, our family have been overestimators here, and by God, that's how we're going to die on this hill. No, it literally, the people didn't know, 15 minutes before the study, they didn't know what they were even doing. But being able to invent these levels of compassion, these levels of comparison and similarity engendered a level of compassion. And so when we're thinking about religious traditions and how are we more compassionate, how do we be more compassionate to the hungry or the homeless? Well, in what way can we see ourselves like them? Right? We're not that they are strangers, right? Because if we view somebody as a stranger, they're going to be different from us. They are our neighbor. How can you see any kind of point or connection here? So you're thinking about the Thanksgiving that's coming up, right? How are we able to show? This is another work that actually that Professor DeSeno has done, which is that actually gratitude is a way to be able to increase our willpower. That Thanksgiving is going to actually help you prevent you from overspending on Black Friday. So again, this is a whole piece that he and I we're doing a whole study on this about Jewish practices and gratitude. So this is just one example of where science and religion can be in conversation, but we can think about everything from climate change to thinking about vaccines, and we can think about why do people, there's actually a lot of research of what got people who are getting vaccines. A lot of people, including me, I got a vaccine as soon as I could. Got a booster as soon as I could. Some people in the religious community, maybe not so much, maybe yes, not so, maybe yes, maybe no. When their pastor said, there's often in the Christian community, more conservative Christian community, if they were actually able to get their pastor to be able to say, I got the vaccine, and here's why, their community got more vaccine, higher vaccine uptake. So these conversations about science and religion, they're not me versus you, one versus the other. This is about how do we become better human beings as an individual, and how do we become better humans as our society as a whole. So that's where this is just a wonderful slide of different ways in which we can think about these different conversations. I'm happy to share this piece, but we can think about the different ways in which science and religion deal with each other in different matrices here. But it's important to realize that we do these conversations interpersonally. We do them collaterally. We do them societally. We do them institutionally. We do them personally. We do them culturally. So there's all sorts of different ways in which the science and religion discussion comes together, a whole variety of different ways. But the bigger question for me is how do we become a better and a fuller human being and a more just and more whole society? So with that, I'm going to stop the formal presentation and open this up for Q&A. So thank you very much. I'm also, by the way, going to hand out a sheet of paper. For people on Zoom, it's okay. We're going to add you once a week. We actually sent it out just a couple hours ago, so you missed this week. But once a week, we send out articles and things that we're working on, and events and videos from everything. We had one about today about lasers and light from the Torah and the role of military technology, to pastors who are talking about how do insects sleep through the winter. So everything that you might think about, we add for that once a week. So I'm going to actually invite people here in person to be able to add their name and email, and people on Zoom will add you get all right. So you can pass that around here. So if you're not yet on it, you can pass this here. But I'll open this up for other questions or comments here. Yes.
Besides evolution and some of the other issues, I think reproductive rights and abortion, to me, are right now are crucial discussion point to try to find some common ground.
Yes.
And I think when you're talking about creating empathy, I think women coming forward and saying why they may have had a medically induced abortion that was for medical reasons, not they didn't want a baby, but this is to save their life, or that I'm going to see, I got to think of how I want to say this, that the production, the miracle wasn't actually a miracle. I'll just put it that way. That there was something wrong. The baby was not going to be viable, was not full term. I think the more these women are willing to step forward and speak about their experience might lead to more compassion, but there's such dogma about, is when does conception happen? When does it become a human? To me, that evolution, whether you believe a dinosaur, God left the bones of the dinosaurs there just to confuse the scientists now, and evolution really happened, is not as concerning to me as what's going on now with women and reproductive rights.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that's why this is. There are a few different questions that come in. One is, what are people's religious values? And by the way, there's a wonderful rabbi named Rabbi Danya Rottenberg who's done some great work on reproductive rights. She has a great book now actually called On Repentance and Repair. But one of the things that she said is that reproductive rights should have been presented as a First Amendment issue and not a privacy piece. And I think that she's not the only one who said that, but I think that's how do religious traditions look at this? And the other question is, for better and for worse, of what the technology of being able to keep fetuses alive, the viability, that's changed also. So that that's also where some of the challenges can be also. And I think you're right. And I think that's one that I appreciate you bringing that up, because for future conversations, that's one where there is some argument where there's religion and science where they can bump up against each other. It's climate change, evolution, and I think reproductive rights is absolutely up there. So yeah, and it's not an easy question, but it is one where we need both the religion and the science in there, and for the same reason of thinking about both what can we do and what should we do, and I think that's it is a thorny issue. Without, yeah, that's, I don't think anyone does. So, yeah.
Slightly continuing what I was saying earlier,
Sure.
but perhaps a little bit more mature thought process. Science is science. It's about facts and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
God is about feeling and thought and compassion and interpersonal relationships and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they're two different worlds that coexist and have to coexist. And I think it's a mistake to try to decide which, because it has to be both. We have to live together as people, and we have to have the science that makes all the stuff we eat and breathe and so on. And I think it's just a tragedy that people use one or the other to try to destroy the other one, because we clearly need both.
Yeah, and I think there's a line that I love that was actually a course I did with a teaching company about actually emergency medicine for everyone, and the emergency room doctor said that his mantra is get curious, not furious, and I think we forget about that, because anger can feel good. Right? We're sharing political memes and showing how awful the other side is feels good, right? But again, it's like candy, right? It feels good, but it doesn't actually give you the nutrients that you need. And the idea is being able to say, tell me, what is your thought process on abortion here, right? Like being able to understand, where does somebody who is pro-life coming from? What are they thinking here? Or if somebody's pro-choice, what are they thinking about here? And being able to challenge ourselves to be able to talk to people that we may disagree with, which can be very hard. Yeah.
If I look around the room here, and I look at all the things that science has given us that makes this room possible, our religious experience is very different than a faith community in 700 AD. Even the lights inside the ark.
Right.
Symbolizing what? The Shekinah glory? I mean, I don't know, but that wouldn't even be there.
Right.
The fabric that I've heard people compliment tonight in the chairs. Science has helped religion evolve.
Yeah.
Then I think of the AIDS crisis. Dying helped the scientists evolve. And many people, eventually worldwide, but perhaps primarily here in the United States first, learned a lot more about the mystery of death through the AIDS crisis, and religiously expressed it in ways that families never really thought about. I think of the AIDS quilt, which is now over 100,000 panels. It's so big that it's not likely to ever be shown in one place. However, science has helped with that, because you can go to the Names Project and see it virtually.
Right.
And so many of the panels, we found out that people who religious specialists were saying were outside of the faith community, we found out from their panels that they were rabbis, that they were believers, and oh, there's a nurse. Oh. And so the quilt religiously taught us, and it all moved our scientists along. to get away from the idea that at first it was just a white middle-class gay male disease.
Right.
So I see them working together all the time.
And absolutely, thank you. And I think that's this question of the human experience informing and being informed by. And I'm glad you brought up the AIDS quilt, because there's an article, I think it's the cover story this week in The Atlantic, about how do we memorialize something that is so massive. And he went to Germany to be able to memorialize the Shoah, but was thinking about also COVID, but we can also think about the AIDS quilt. And by the way, questions of memory are also really integral to both religion and science. That's something that we do all the time with Sinai and Synapses. What do we remember and what do we not? It's a presentation that I do all the time. What do we remember? What do we not remember? How do we memorialize? And how do we memorialize individuals? How do we memorialize when a number is inconceivable? Those are all of those pieces come into what you're saying. So thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question, if there is one. If there's anybody on Zoom as well. Yeah. Yeah, maybe we'll have one last comment. Then I think there's a lovely reception here back as well. So.
When we were having the discussion, talking about the miracle of birth, I guess what I'm interested in is the conversation made me think of this from the four cons that you talked about, where mine might fit in. I guess it would be the last one, in contact. But I see science informing my faith. Mm-hmm. The fact that every human being is an absolute miracle in the presence. The fact that I have evolved, my journey began 13.7 billion years ago. And the fact that I'm here in this room with you tonight and with these people who are listening and learning, that's all because of science.
Yep.
And that's sacred knowledge. I have a T-shirt I was going to wear, but it was dirty. It said science is divine. And I love that. I love that. I mean, science helps me appreciate the fact that my life is a miracle, mm-hmm. and I'm alive. New images from the James Webb Telescope blow me away on a regular basis. Yep. So, I mean, would that be concert?
Yeah, I think that is, for me, I think that's the contact model for sure. Because concert model is trying to be able to say, well, the James Webb Telescope, maybe we can understand that the language of Genesis actually talks about which we can talk about that poetically. If it's poetically, that's fine. But no, what you're talking about, I think, is a wonderful way of confluence. And there's one of my favorite lines in rabbinic literature. It's from Mishnah. I think it's Sanhedrin chapter 4-5, where the rabbis are asking, why did God, because God could have created so many things. God created thousands of trees and all the mountains and lots of animals and one human being, right? God could have created all, at least within the rabbinic mind, God could have created all of us here de novo. Instead, we're all descendants of Adam and then later Adam and Eve. And the question is why? And the rabbis give a whole different variety of reasons, including one saying no one can say my ancestor is greater than your ancestor. But one is to be able to say that a human king, and it was very male language, a human king, they stamp a coin, and every coin in the king's image, because every coin had to have the king's image, it all looked exactly the same, right? Every quarter, basically every penny is exactly the same, or at least the obverse side, the eagle side, right? You know what I'm talking about. Every coin is basically the same. But what the rabbis say is that every human being is stamped in the image of God, and yet no one is exactly alike. And it's this wonderful balance of almost the conservative and liberal element, right, where there's a tension. There's a universality and there's a particularity. All right? There are some parts of it where every human being is exactly the same across the whole world. Everyone has the same emotions. Everyone has the same need for love. Everyone needs to be raised in a society in some way. Everyone needs to eat. Right? There are certain ways, but how that manifests itself varies from culture to culture and person to person. And so it is this wonderful miracle of being able to be the same as everybody else here in so many ways and different from everybody in so many different ways. So I think that's a wonderful way to be able to do one of the things that we all need to do as human beings, which is to be able to eat a little bit and nourish. We've nourished our souls, be able to nourish our bodies. So thank you all for being with us here this evening. Thank you everyone on Zoom as well.
Thank you very much. This was very, very informative.
I'm
Really
glad
enjoyed it. Made me think a lot.
Thank you.